that someone recommended this case. However, I'm struggling to find out who it was, so I can only apologise, but please make yourself known in the comments so I can thank you directly. But on a wider note, I want to thank you all for supporting the channel. It really means a lot. Now on with the video. Gary Heidnik was an American double murderer and serial rapist with a hatred of women, who, over a 4-month period between 1986 and 1987, abducted 6 women off the streets of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and held them captive in the basement of his home. He beat, tortured, and raped his captives, and whilst 4 of them miraculously survived, 2 were murdered, and one of these was dismembered. Heidnik was one of the inspirations for the character Buffalo Bill from the film Silence of the Lambs, but when you hear his story, I've no doubt you'll think he's a man far worse than any movie villain, and what he put these women through was worse than any horror movie and like something out of a nightmare. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Gary Michael Heidnik was born on November the 22nd, 1943, in the Cleveland suburb of Eastlake in Ohio, to Michael and Ellen. He also had a younger brother, Trevor. Whilst Michael stated the boys were raised in a loving household, it appears it was anything but. Trevor later reported that Michael was extremely violent towards all members of the family and would beat his sons and his wife. Trevor said in an interview in 1987, quote, "It got to the point where we'd be afraid to pick anything up because he'd beat us if we dropped something like a glass or something. I was knocked unconscious once." When Heidnik was 3 years old, his parents separated and the boys went to live with their mother. However, this environment was also no place for a child, with their mother having issues with alcohol, and she would often leave the children alone while she went out drinking, bringing home different men most nights. After 4 years, the boys were returned to the care of their father and his new wife, as his mother could no longer take care of them. So both of them went out of the frying pan and back into the fire, and Heidnik reported persistent emotional and psychological abuse by his father. Heidnik was a chronic bedwetter, with his father humiliating him whenever this happened by making him hang the urine-soaked sheets out of the window in full view of the neighbours. Also, it's reported that Heidnik and his brother were forced to wear trousers with, I assume, fabric bullseyes sewn onto them, which children at school would kick. This compounded the abuse that Heidnik already suffered, due to him receiving a serious injury to his head when he was 6 years old, which left it misshapen after he fell out of a tree. In addition, Michael had particularly discriminatory attitudes and beliefs regarding African Americans, and instilled in his sons his racist views that these individuals were lesser forms of life due to the colour of their skin. Heidnik was a morose and solitary child. He made no effort to engage with other children and appeared very aloof. On one occasion, Heidnik was approached by a female student who asked him if he'd done his homework, to which Heidnik had responded by shouting at her, saying she was, quote, "not worthy to speak to him." Heidnik excelled academically and was reported to have an IQ of 148, which would put him in the exceptionally gifted category. However, he had no direction in life and seemed rudderless, with him flitting from one potential profession to another. This began at the age of 14 years old, when Heidnik enrolled at Staunton Military Academy in Staunton, Virginia, but dropped out 2 years later before graduating. He then returned to school, but then dropped out at the age of 17 and joined the United States Army. It appeared that by this point, Heidnik had developed 2 obsessions: becoming an army officer and making money. Heidnik was described as an excellent recruit, but following basic training, he was rejected from several specialist positions. This included in the military police, and instead he trained as an army medic in San Antonio, Texas, and as a side hustle, he lent money to fellow soldiers and charged them interest on these loans. Heidnik was then transferred to a field hospital in West Germany. However, things began to fall apart for Gary Heidnik in late August 1962 at the age of 19, when he went to the sick bay complaining of dizziness, blurred vision and nausea. It's also noted that Heidnik began showing signs of mental illness, and although it's not clear what he was suffering from, given the fact he was prescribed antipsychotics, it's likely he was showing signs of schizophrenia, which potentially included him experiencing delusions and hallucinations. However, there are some who believe that he faked this diagnosis to get a discharge from the army. However, it should be noted that mental illness does appear to have been a common factor in Heidnik's family, with his brother Trevor spending time in mental institutions and attempting suicide multiple times during his life. And in 1970, Ellen, his mother, committed suicide by poisoning herself. With regards to Heidnik, he would be admitted to psychiatric hospitals no less than 20 times between 1962 and 1987 due to repeated suicide attempts. In October 1962, Heidnik was transferred to a military hospital in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where he was diagnosed with schizoid personality disorder. This is a condition characterized by someone who chooses to be alone and chooses to pursue solitary habits, whilst having little or no desire to interact with others outside of necessary interactions. They also have difficulty expressing emotions and reacting appropriately to situations, and they're often outwardly humourless, emotionally detached, and cold to others. It appears, due to this diagnosis, Heidnik was honourably discharged from the army and given a disability allowance. Heidnik had served a grand total of 13 months serving his country. Shortly after his discharge, he became a licensed practical nurse and enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania, only to drop out a single semester later. He worked at a VA hospital in Coatesville, but was fired for poor attendance and rude behaviour towards patients, with him showing no empathy towards them and being aggressive generally towards staff and patients. It appears that despite his high intellect, Heidnik was unable to hold down a job or actually pursue a career, and he appears to have been quite entitled. It seems like he wanted to be handed professions on a plate, and when he found out this wouldn't happen immediately and would require some work, he would leave. So, with the army, when he realised he wasn't going to be promoted to a 4-star general by a week on Thursday, he got bored and wandered off. It's important to note the types of jobs or careers Heidnik was pursuing, with them all being ones where someone has power over another, whether this be an officer in the armed forces, a police officer, or a nurse. In October 1971, Heidnik set up a church called, quote, the United Church of the Ministers of God. Initially the church had just 5 members. In 1975, he opened an account under the church's name with Merrill Lynch. The initial deposit was $1,500, but, through shrewd investment, within 10 years Heidnik had turned this into $500,000, and the church eventually grew to 50 devoted followers, led by the self-anointed Bishop Gary Heidnik. It appears this church was, in part, set up so that Heidnik could avoid paying taxes, but I think it served another purpose. It gave Heidnik a captive audience. It gave him people that would hang on his every word, and give him the sense of power he'd been attempting to find throughout his life up until this point. As this church gave him money and a sense of power, Heidnik stuck with it. It was still active at the time of his arrest in 1987, with them contacting investigators to ask whether Bishop Heidnik would soon be released to lead the congregation. Some authors say that Heidnik's ultimate intention was to turn his church into a cult, and I wouldn't be surprised, as it's clear he was a man who wanted power and others doing exactly what he said, following his every command without question. However, whilst Heidnik professed to speak the word of God, his behaviour towards others was anything but holy. It appears that Gary Heidnik's first serious brush with the law was in 1976, when, after a disagreement with the tenant at a house he was renting, he fired a gun at him, with a bullet grazing his face. It's reported that in the 1970s, Heidnik would begin relationships with African American women, with him telling others that these women, quote, treated him better than whites ever did. However, he would also specifically pick women with severe learning disabilities. This, I think, is a combination of Heidnik's racist beliefs, his narcissism, and further evidence of him wanting to place himself in positions where he controlled people. Due to his childhood, it appears that Heidnik considered African Americans to be inferior and therefore less of a threat to him. When you also add in the disability aspect, in his mind, Heidnik likely felt there was a massive power disparity in these relationships, with him being totally in control of them, being able to use and abuse his partners at will. One such woman was called Anjanette Davidson, who had significant learning disabilities. Anjanette had a sister, Alberta, who lived in a mental health institute. Alberta was a 34-year-old woman who had the mental capacity of a 5-year-old. One day in 1978, Heidnik signed Alberta out of the institution, apparently on day release. He then took her back to his property and kept her chained up in the basement. Over the next 9 days, he repeatedly raped and sodomized Alberta. When she didn't return, the institution called the police and a search was conducted of Heidnik's property, but nothing was found, and he bought time by claiming that he put her back on a bus home. When a second search was conducted, Alberta was found confined in a small storeroom in the basement. After Alberta was medically examined, she was found to have clear signs of sexual assault, including tears in her vagina. She had also contracted gonorrhea. Heidnik was subsequently charged with kidnapping, rape, false imprisonment, unlawful restraint, and interfering with the custody of a committed person, amongst other offences. At his trial in November 1978, Heidnik pleaded not guilty, and heartbreakingly, Alberta, due to her cognitive difficulties, was deemed unfit to testify. So, as opposed to a list of charges which would have placed Gary Heidnik behind bars forever, many of the most serious charges had to be dropped. He was eventually only convicted of unlawful restraint, interfering with the custody of a committed person, and recklessly endangering another person. The psychiatrist who assessed Heidnik indicates he showed no remorse for his actions and was extremely likely to commit similar or worse offences in the future. Heidnik was sentenced to 3 to 7 years in the state penitentiary, eventually serving 4 and being released on March 24, 1983. It isn't clear whether Heidnik's initial thinking around targeting mentally disabled women included the fact that if he was caught, he could simply plead not guilty and they would not be able to testify against him. I think this is likely. However, even if this wasn't the case, he now had an example of the power of this strategy, with him likely thinking, yeah, I went to prison, but I served 4 rather than 24 years. I've no doubt that Heidnik was looking for loopholes and ways to avoid detection and punishment, whilst planning and fantasising about his ultimate goal, to have control over completely subservient women who would be his personal sex slaves. Soon after his release from prison, Heidnik began using a matrimonial service and began to communicate with a woman called Betty Disto in the Philippines. In September 1985, she flew over to the US and married Heidnik in Maryland on the 3rd of October 1985. No doubt Heidnik thought that she, due to her ethnic origin, would be subservient and easy to control. He was wrong. Betty would frequently voice her concerns and hold her husband accountable for his appalling behaviour, which included him forcing her to watch whilst he had sex with other women. During their brief marriage, Betty was raped and beaten repeatedly, and it was only with the help of the Filipino community in Philadelphia that she was able to escape the marriage in January 1986. Soon afterwards, Heidnik was arrested for assault, indecent assault, spousal rape, and involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, but all charges were dropped when Betty, likely through fear, did not attend the court case. At this point, I imagine the wheels in Heidnik's twisted mind were turning, with him realising that if he wished to have a harem of women at his command, he needed to return to his original victim typology and replicate the behaviour which had given him some limited success before, specifically in the case of Alberta, confining this woman in the basement. If he could find similar vulnerable women and bring them to his basement, he would have the on-demand sex slaves he was desperate to acquire. By November 1986, Heidnik decided to put his horrific plan into action. In total, Gary Heidnik abducted 6 women from the streets of Philadelphia, with the first being 25-year-old Josefina Rivera, who, on November the 25th, 1986, was working as a prostitute in order to support her family. She was picked up by Heidnik in his white Cadillac, where he paid her for her services. After this, they went to McDonald's, where Heidnik bought Josefina some coffee. Josefina then agreed to a further trade of sex for money, but this time Heidnik wanted to do it at his home, to which she agreed. So Heidnik drove Josefina to 3520 North Marshall Street. Josefina later recalled being suspicious when she got to the home, noticing that in the front door was half a key, with Heidnik having the other half, and the door could only be opened when these 2 parts were held together. What Josefina didn't realise was that this was so that the keyhole could not be seen through, and the lock was essentially blocked, meaning it could only be opened from the outside. After having sex in the main bedroom, Josephina went to put her clothes back on, and Heidnik then grabbed her by the neck from behind and began to choke her. She begged him to stop, but instead, he handcuffed her wrists and pushed her down the stairs to the basement. Heidnik then got a shovel and began digging a hole in the floor of the basement, whilst telling the handcuffed Josephina that he was planning to capture 10 women whom he would force to get pregnant, and then they would raise his children. She was then pushed through the hole. She tried to escape but could not, and Heidnik left and didn't return for 27 hours, but when he didn't return alone. Sandra Lindsay was also 25 years old, and she was extremely vulnerable and was a patient at a care facility called the Elwyn Institute. Sandra was already known to Heidnik, as he'd previously raped her in the facility where she was staying, and she'd fallen pregnant but had an abortion. On November the 26th, 1986, Heidnik took Sandra from the Elwyn Institute and brought her back to his home. Heidnik told Sandra to write a letter to her mother saying she'd left the institute and that she was fine. He then went to New York and posted this letter. However, Sandra's mother did not believe the contents and went to the police. She must have known about Heidnik, as she gave the police his address and said her daughter was likely being held there. Tragically, the police did nothing, assuming Sandra was just another runaway. On the first night that both women were together, they were viciously raped and beaten by Heidnik, and this pattern continued each and every day. They were kept naked and had to huddle together for warmth in the unheated basement. They slowly began to fall ill due to hypothermia, starvation, and dehydration. On the 22nd of December 1986, 19-year-old Lisa Thomas was walking to a friend's house when Heidnik pulled up alongside her and asked if she was working the streets. Lisa was not a prostitute and was offended. Heidnik said he would take her wherever she wanted as a way to apologise. Eventually, the pair ended up going to dinner and then back to his house, where he drugged her wine, and Lisa soon fell unconscious. She awoke to Heidnik dragging her to the bedroom, where he raped her. He then handcuffed her and threw her in the pit in the basement. On the 2nd of January 1987, Heidnik abducted 23-year-old Deborah Dudley. It's not known how he came across her, but it appears that she was potentially homeless at the time. Deborah fought every step of the way, and Heidnik had trouble subduing her and placing her in the hole. She was viciously beaten and eventually took her place with the other captives. 18-year-old Jacqueline Askins was a sex worker who Heidnik picked up on the 18th of January 1987. After agreeing to money for sex, Jacqueline went to Heidnik's home and, after having sex, he strangled her, cuffed her, and forced her into the hole. So by the 18th of January 1987, there were 5 women chained up in Gary Heidnik's basement. By this point, the first woman he abducted, Josephina Rivera, had been living this nightmare for 52 days. Heidnik would rape and beat the women without mercy. He'd also try to divide and conquer them, with him assigning one as the leader when he went out, and when he got back, he would ask the leader which of the women had misbehaved. If no one was singled out, they would all be beaten. No doubt in order to heighten their terror, Heidnik would shove sharp objects into the women's ears in an attempt to deafen them so they could not hear him coming, but also so they didn't know when he'd left so they couldn't try to escape. Heidnik would feed the women as and when he pleased, and his erratic behaviour appeared to dictate how often they would be fed and what they would receive. On some days they'd get nothing, on other days they might get dog food, but on one occasion, to celebrate one of the captive women's birthdays, he provided them with Chinese food and champagne. However, the women were malnourished, dehydrated, suffering from hypothermia, battered, bruised, and in considerable pain, with several of them becoming seriously unwell, especially Sandra Lindsay. In February 1987, Sandra angered Heidnik by trying to remove the planks of wood that sat over the hole in the basement. In response, he handcuffed one of Sandra's wrists to a beam in the ceiling and left her hanging there for days. Convinced she was pregnant with his child, Heidnik tried to force feed her in order to keep the child alive, but in a weakened state, Sandra's body was beginning to give up. Eventually, she died, and when the handcuff was removed, she slumped to the floor. Josephina said when she saw Sandra was dead, quote, "I was broken-hearted. Me and Sandra were close. We spent so many hours together in the hole." Heidnik, the monster that he was, with cold efficiency, then sought to get rid of Sandra's body. He forced the other women to be involved in dissecting her body and used a power saw to remove her limbs, with him putting Sandra's legs and arms in the freezer, marking them as, quote, "dog food." Heidnik cooked her ribs in the oven and put Sandra's head on a stove to boil. Heidnik showed Deborah Dudley, who had fought him so hard when she was abducted, Sandra's head on the stove and warned her that she would end up the same way if she defied him. There's a rumour that Sandra's remains were ground up, mixed with dog food and fed to the other women, but this isn't backed up by the evidence. The putrid smell from cooking Sandra's body parts led to neighbours calling the police, and, when they attended, Heidnik simply said that he'd burnt a roast, and they left. Whilst raping and torturing these women, Heidnik would occasionally leave the basement, go upstairs in his property, and hold sermons for his church congregation before returning to continue his vile abuse. Heidnik would also use electricity to torture the women, applying a live wire to their chains, giving them electric shocks. On March the 19th, 1987, Heidnik put 3 of the women, including Deborah Dudley, into a pit filled with water whilst they were wearing chains. He then applied mains current to their bindings, and, as a result of this, Deborah died. By this point, Josephina realised the only way she was going to survive was to pretend to be compliant, and she began to convince Heidnik that she was enjoying her time with him and she was given more trust and more freedom. This included her assisting him in removing Deborah's body from the property and dumping her remains, and agreeing with him that they needed to abduct another woman in order to replace the 2 who had died. As a result of this, Heidnik would take Josephina out in his car in order to look for women to abduct. On the 23rd of March 1987, they came across 24-year-old Agnes Adams, who was known to both of them, as Heidnik had previously engaged in her services as a sex worker, and Josephina from when the pair had worked in a strip club together. She was taken back to the property, assaulted, and forced into the hole in the basement. This appeared to cement Heidnik's trust in Josephina, and on the 24th of March 1987, she asked if she could go visit family, and she promised to return with a new woman for his collection. Heidnik agreed and drove Josephina to a petrol station and said he would wait there while she went to see her relatives. Josephina then walked a short distance away and called the police. When they arrived, they saw the imprint of restraints on her leg and thankfully believed her. The police then drove to the petrol station and arrested Gary Heidnik. The police then went to Heidnik's property and opened the basement to release the surviving women. This stunning and horrific picture shows what the officers found when they peered into the hole. The police were able to recover the body of Deborah Dudley and were able to recover some of the body parts of Sandra Lindsay. This included removing her arms and legs from the freezer. They also found pieces of her thigh, skin and muscle, all neatly wrapped. Over 27 pounds of dismembered human remains were recovered in total. To close this section, I want to play a short clip of Josephina Rivera talking about her experiences in around 2014.
Here with me now is Josephina Rivera. Thank you so much, Josephina. I've watched this. This is the first time that I've actually seen this, and I'm trying to hold back my tears.
Right.
So I can't even imagine what you endured.
We endured a lot. We really endured a lot. I truly endured a lot, especially in the beginning, being the first one. I could just so remember just sleeping with handcuffs behind my back every night and chains on my ankles, and I would wake up and just think it was a dream, you know.
Or a nightmare, really.
A nightmare.
Right. During that time, what kept you going? What kept you alive throughout all the torture and the cruelty that you endured on a daily basis?
Through the strength of God, and I just said I'm going out of here the way I came in here. If I walked in here, I'm going to walk out of here.
So that was really that's what kept you focused
yes,
on that you're going to get at, the sense of determination.
Right.
What was the interaction between you and the other women?
It was really, really very difficult. I mean, we're in a situation where none of us know each other, and each one is dealing with different mental stability. And, you know, I try my best, being the first one down there, trying to calm everybody that came down. It didn't always work, you know, but, you know, you try to, you know, sit down and talk and try to keep them, you know, you ask them about their family and their kids and their life, and, you know, try to make it a little bit normalcy for them as much as possible, you know, and try to say, well, hey, you're going to be all right, you know, we're going to try to get out of here alive. And it was difficult at times. It was. When Sandra died, me and Sandra had been there from the beginning, so when Sandra died, it just really broke my heart, and it just really made me see the severity of Gary Heidnik.
Did you think you were next after she died? Did you think that he was going to go after you?
Oh, at that point, it was like anything could happen. You know, it was like a day-by-day thing. It was just, each day was worse than the day before. You know, and it just never seemed like it was getting any better.
Did you ever think, Josephina, that you were going to get out of there? Did you ever plot it? Did you ever talk
I
with the
didn't
other
plot
women?
it. I really didn't realize how much Gary Heidnik actually liked me and how much I was getting through to him until the last few days. I knew I was going to get out of there one way or another. I mean, that was like my ultimate goal, was to make sure that I got out safely and he couldn't get to me and he couldn't get back to the other girls and get rid of them, you know. And so I don't know if there was a plan, but it worked out.
But a sense of survival that you
Yes.
had to keep yourself going throughout, no matter what. Throughout
Exactly,
that time.
and trying to deal with Heidnik himself, and then trying to deal with the other girls, and trying to put something together. It was amazing.
Now you still have some injury from what he did with
Right,
your ears.
yeah.
Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, he found out that we could hear him underground coming in and out, his car pulling in and out of the driveway, because his
walking.
basement sat underground and we could hear him walking through the house. So he decided to take screwdrivers and damage our eardrums with screwdrivers.
Did you?
To dent our ears so that we wouldn't be able to hear him coming in and out.
And you still have difficulty
Yeah.
with hearing.
Oh yeah, everything I listen to is loud.
Now, you have children, and you were reunited with your children.
Yes, I
recently.
was.
How's that?
Ricky and Zornay, I put up for adoption right after the Heidnik thing happened. At the time, the foster parents and Zornay and Ricky were very close, and they were in a loving home. I personally, mentally or physically, wasn't mentally capable of taking care of them. So my decision for them to allow them to adopt them was a good thing. Me and LaToya stayed in touch. She came back and lived with me when she was 12, and we stayed close.
Remember what I said about Gary Heidnik having an almost genius level IQ before? Well, on the 23rd of April 1987, he walked into court and pleaded not guilty to all offences. His initial defence? The women were already there when he moved in. That's it. This later appears to have changed, him claiming he knew about the women, but they'd killed each other. Heidnik also made claims of cannibalism, but this was not backed up by evidence when forensic analysis of cooking utensils was undertaken, and it appears this was likely part of an insanity defence. The question of mental illness was central to this case, but the brave testimony of the surviving victims showed how methodical and planned these offences were. In addition, it was pointed out that Heidnik was competent enough to make hundreds of thousands of dollars from investments and run a church for over 10 years. The jury didn't believe a word of it, and on the 1st of July 1988, Gary Heidnik was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, 5 counts of kidnapping, 5 counts of rape, 4 of aggravated assault, and 1 of involuntary deviant sexual intercourse. He was then sentenced to death. Gary Heidnik spent over a decade on death row and never admitted any guilt or showed any remorse for his crimes. In January 1999, he tried to escape his date with the executioner by attempting to take an overdose, but this was unsuccessful. Before his execution, Heidnik reportedly claimed that he wanted to be executed because the execution of an innocent man would stop the death penalty in America. Just before 10 p.m. on Tuesday, July the 6th, 1999, after a last meal of 2 slices of pizza and black coffee, Gary Heidnik stepped into the death chamber at SCI Rockview and was strapped to the gurney. At 10:12 p.m, the execution began and the lethal injection was administered. He was pronounced dead at 10:29 p.m. and, when this occurred, one of the witnesses reportedly shouted, quote, "Thank you, Jesus." He made no final statement. Before talking about this monster, I want to play a short clip of him speaking during an interview after his incarceration. Look at this man's eyes. I, for one, find them terrifying.
How much verbal exchange did you have with the girls down there in the basement?
At first, I tried to make it nice, right?
Yeah, how did you do that, Gary?
I was holding parties there for one thing. I had a Christmas party and a New Year's party.
Heidnik told agents Douglas and Ray that he had a routine for the women he held captive in his basement.
8, they go down in the hole in the morning. Board goes over the top of the hole with the sandbags and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then they stay down there till roughly about 8 at night. Okay. Now, on this particular day...
You got a radio down here, right?
Oh, yeah.
Playing real loud?
Yes.
Why is that? To drown out any noise?
Right.
In case because you're leaving the house sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah, so you don't
I was, you know, I'm not holding nothing back. I realize that's incriminating. That's incriminating for me to say that in a state of mind. I was conscious enough to know that was a conscious act on my part, and that was essentially the reason.
To drown out that noise, for sure.
Well, they might like a little entertainment, too, you know.
The radio didn't stop the women from screaming for help, so Gary Heidnik tried shocking them into silence with electricity.
You do say that you were electrocuted as punishment.
Yeah.
And you did that systematically for some time.
No. Only several days. Nothing was working. I was trying to find something that worked that would make them shut up to stop hollering.
So you got a progressive kind of infliction of pain on these women.
I was trying to find something that would make them behave.
But it was painful to them.
I hope so. I don't mean I hope so, but I mean, you know, that's what I was trying to achieve, you know, to make them behave.
After one of the victims died from torture, Heidnik told Douglas and Ray he didn't know what to do with the body.
I'm sitting there, you know, trying to figure out what the hell to do, you know. What the to do, you know. I started chopping up the body. It makes me sick just thinking about it. I dismembered the body and I you know, started burning it on the stove and in the oven and stuff, and that was when you got the big smell and all.
You're trying to destroy the evidence.
Right.
See, some people.
I consciously knew I was trying to hide the evidence.
The lack of remorse and delusion in this man is truly horrifying. Gary Heidnik is reported to have been one of the worst, most frightening killers the FBI agent John Douglas ever spoke to. He's the man whose career was the basis for the television series Mindhunter. Remember, he interviewed some of the most depraved and vicious killers of modern time, including Edmund Kemper, John Wayne Gacy, and Ted Bundy. So for Heidnik to be at the top of this infamous list is really saying something. I would agree that this man's crimes are particularly heinous, but why did he do it? I think that due to his traumatic childhood, Heidnik developed a general hatred of society, but in particular women, likely due to the lack of care from his mother. Also, due to the racist views of his father, I believe that Heidnik considered those from any ethnic background, but particularly African Americans, as an even lesser form of life. Likely due to his intellect, Heidnik appears to have felt that he was special and worthy of great things, and that others were not worthy of him. Given his gifts, I think that he assumed that people should just hand him power, and so he tried to integrate himself into society by applying for these types of positions. But, due to his own arrogance and his lack of any social skills, he was unable to obtain them, and also likely because he wasn't given what he wanted quickly enough. So, he took matters into his own hands, creating scenarios in his own life where he could feel ultimate power over people, reinforcing to himself how superior he was. This included him beginning relationships with women with intellectual disabilities, knowing they were no match for him intellectually. Whilst he likely felt very powerful in these situations, he was essentially an utter coward, a tiny little man who would rape and abuse, in some cases, women who had the mental age of children. Whilst there may have been a financial motivation to him setting up his church, I have no doubt he had aspirations of being a cult leader, having ultimate power over people, commanding their every move, using them any way he wanted, and ultimately ordering their suicide if he deemed it necessary. As he amassed his religious congregation, he also collected women, like objects, using them to get his sexual kicks, and no doubt getting off on the fact they were powerless and he could kill them at any moment. I think that Gary Heidnik considered himself a god and wanted mere mortals to fear him and acknowledge his superiority over them. What Heidnik was ultimately planning to do is anyone's guess. Perhaps he was going to breed a colony, create his own cult from the ground up. However, what I find so perfect about this case is that one of these African American women, who he considered so beneath him, outsmarted him, manipulated him into believing that she supported his lunacy, and she was eventually able to take him down and save the lives of others. So, what's your thoughts on this case? Had you heard about the crimes of Gary Heidnik before? Is it just me, or do you think whilst he might have been the inspiration for Buffalo Bill, his crimes are so much worse? Anyway, if you like the content, please consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, which is £2.99 a month or around $4. You get early access to videos and an icon next to your name, which changes from bronze to silver to gold, depending on how long you're a member. Also, consider sending a super thanks, which is a one-off payment to support the channel. Also, please like, share and subscribe. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.